Yum, yum!
Hey, this is Ed Ferrari from Pixel Fondue, and in this short video series, I'm going to cover the basics of working with Mesh Fusion. In this first video, I'm going to demonstrate the three main operations that make up the core of Mesh Fusion. So to get started, I'm going to need some geometry, and I'm going to use the cubics that ship with Modo. So I'm in the model layout, and I'm going to come over to the Fusion vertical tab, and then in the Fusion Meshes section, I'm going to click on Cubic Geometry. That brings up the Fusion Cubic preset browser. So in order to navigate to the Cubics folder, I'm going to double-click on the Fusion Assets folder, then I'll double-click on the Fusion Meshes folder, and finally I'll double-click on the Cubics folder. Now these cubics are mesh presets that are all quad, all Catmull-Clark subdivision surfaces that are tailor-made for working with Mesh Fusion. Now as of Modo 10.2, Mesh Fusion does a really good job of working on meshes that aren't ideal for fusing. So if you have a mesh that's not all quads, if you have a few triangles or some n-gons, Mesh Fusion does a really good job now of working with it. But ideally, you do want to have mostly quads, if not all quads. So I'm going to select a cube, so I'll choose this Q medium cube, and I'm actually going to bring in another one, so I'll double click that again. And I'll press W for the move tool, and I'm just going to offset the second cube a little bit in the Y, X, and Z. And then I'll also scale that uniformly, just so it's kind of covering one of the corners of the original cube. Spacebar to drop the tool, and then in the item list I'm going to select the camera and the directional light, and just drag them to the top of the scene. And I'm also going to delete the empty mesh item, and this is just to keep things nice and tidy. So I want these two cubes to be the base of my fusion operation. I want these two cubes to be the positive aspects that I'm going to trim away from. So in Mesh Fusion, the positive or additive aspect of the fusion item is known as a primary. So I'm going to convert these two mesh items into primary sources. So I'm going to come over to the top of the Fusion toolbox, and I'm going to click on New Fusion, and that brings up this popover. I'm going to give our new fusion a name. I'll call it fuse_practice. And then I'm going to leave the strip properties at their defaults, and I'll just click on New Fusion with selected meshes. And you'll notice a few things have happened. Firstly, we have a new item in the item list. This is a fusion item, and it's highlighted in white. And if I make that invisible, now all we have visible are the two cube items. And in the item list, they're highlighted in green, and that green color corresponds to the wireframe in the viewport. And you'll notice that the surfaces of these two wireframes are no longer visible. So if I make the fusion item visible again, you can see where the two cubes intersect. We have this little tiny kind of fillet. And this is actually where the strip is occurring. And in the next video, I'm going to cover strips and strip corners, strip widths, and strip profiles. But if we select one of the cubes, I'll select the smaller cube, and just hit W to move, and move this, you'll see that the area where they intersect actually updates live, which is pretty nice. And it's very responsive. So as I mentioned, the green wireframe and the green color in the item list represents the primary, and that's additive. Now what if we want to subtract an item from these primaries? So first I'll need some more geometry. So I'm going to come over to the Cubic preset browser, and I think I'll just add another cube. So I'll double click the cube, and then I'm going to drag this cube beneath the two primaries just to keep things nice and organized. And then with that cube selected, I'm just going to position it and scale it just so it looks a little bit different from the other cubes. So there we go. Now at the moment, this cube is not a part of the fusion item. It's not a part of the fusion setup. So I'm just going to assign a role to this mesh item, and I'm going to set that role to be a trim subtractive. So to do that, I'll come over to the Fusion toolbox, and I'm going to select this second icon underneath Set or Change Mesh Role. And the second icon is Set Mesh Role to Subtractive Trim. So when I click that, you'll notice two things. One, in the item list, the third cube is now highlighted in magenta, and the wireframe in the viewport is set to magenta. So magenta is the color coding for trim subtractive. Now, even though this mesh item knows its role, it's not currently in a relationship with these two primaries, and that's why it's not having an effect. So if I wanted to have an effect with these two primary items, I can simply select the subtractive cube, shift select the two primaries, and then come over to the Fusion toolbox and choose the first icon underneath trim/untrim. So this trim icon will trim away from both of those primaries. And now, if I just select the third cube and start moving it around, you'll see that we're getting a fusion happening, and it's updating in real time, which is really nice. So we can move this around. I can scale this with R. So it's really, really interactive. Now there is a third operation, and that's the trim intersect. But before we get to that, let's just really pay attention to what's happening here with this trim subtractive. So everything on the inside of this magenta box is being trimmed away, and everything on the outside of this magenta box is being maintained. Now the trim intersect has the opposite effect of this trim subtract. The trim intersect will trim away everything on the outside of its bounds, and it will keep everything on the inside. So let me create a third cube to show that in action. So I'm going to go back to the cubic geometry preset browser, and I'll create another cube. In the item list, I'll pull this cube beneath the trim subtractive, and then let me just scale this so that it's a little bit different than the other cubes. So I'll just make it a nice tall box, and with this tall box selected, I'm going to come over to Set or Change Mesh Roll, and I'm going to choose the third icon, which is Set Mesh Roll to Intersect Trim. And you'll notice that it has a purple wireframe. That's the color for Trim Intersect. So with that tall box selected, and then I'm going to shift select the two primaries, I'm then going to come over to the Trim Untrim buttons, and I'm going to choose Trim, the first icon. There we go. So now everything is trimmed away except for what exists within the tall box, and that tall box can be moved as well, and it will update. So that's pretty neat. Sometimes when learning Mesh Fusion, the best thing you can do is just create some geometry and just pay attention to how things work, and just kind of pay attention to the behavior here. And of course, these primaries can be moved as well. Now, if I want to get a look at the Fusion item without the Fusion sources in the way, I can bring up the Fusion Pie menu by holding Control F, and I can choose the rightmost option, which is Toggle Source Visibility. And now I just have a good look at just the Fusion item. And again, if I want to see the Fusion sources, I can either come over to the item list and make them visible here, or I can again return to the Fusion Pie menu by holding Control F and choosing Toggle Source Visibility. Now, if I want to take one of the Fusion sources and have them no longer be a part of the Fusion setup, let's say, for instance, I want this tall cube to no longer be a trim intersect, I can select it, and then in the Fusion toolbox, I can come over to the fourth icon underneath Set or Change Mesh Roll, and that's Clear Fusion Mesh Roll. So when I click that, this tall box is now just a regular mesh item. And I can either delete it or just move it out of the way. I can also set it to a different role. So this can now become primary. I can select it, and then I can come over to the first icon underneath Set or Change Mesh Roll, and that will set it to a primary. And then I can kind of reintroduce it like so. Now you'll notice that even though this tall box is now a part of the Fusion item, because we can see this little tiny fillet happening here, it's actually not being trimmed by this magenta cube. So in order to get that to work, we'll have to select the magenta cube, which is the trim item, shift select the tall box, and then click on trim. And there we go. and you'll see that there's a little bit of it that's not being trimmed. And I could change that by just moving the trim item, scaling the trim item, or moving the primary up like so. Now I've been using the buttons inside the Fusion toolbox here on the left side, but there's also something else that's really cool. So let me actually remove these two boxes from the Fusion equation, and I'm going to show you how we can use the drag and drop options. And this is actually how I prefer to work. So I'm going to left mouse button click on this tall box and drag it onto this primary, and that brings up this popover, and I can just choose Fusion Apply Subtraction, Fusion Apply Primary, or Fusion Apply Intersect. So in this case, I think I'm going to choose Fusion Apply Subtraction. Now it's subtracting from this cube, but it's not subtracting from this second cube, the larger cube. So again, I'm going to left mouse button click on this tall cube, which is now a subtractive element, and I'll just drag that onto the larger cube primary. And when this popover comes up, I'll just choose Fusion Trim. So now it's trimming from both. And I can do the same thing with this cube right here that's not currently part of the Fusion setup. So I'll left mouse button click on this cube, drag it onto this other cube, and this time I think I'll choose Fusion Apply Intersect. There we go. Now it's not intersecting with this primary here, so I'll left mouse button click on this intersect cube, the purple cube, and I'll just drag it onto this primary, and I'll choose Fusion Trim. There we go. Now, the Fusion is only available where this purple box exists. It only exists within this purple intersect cube. And then again, Control F to bring up my Fusion Pie menu, and I'll choose Toggle Source Visibility just to get a look at what we've created. So again, it's really a good idea just to kind of play around with Mesh Fusion, make something non-representational, just kind of to get a feel for how the tool works. You just make something that's really just a sketch. So in the next video, we're going to cover Fusion strips, changing the strip widths, the strip profiles, and strip corners. So I hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching.
Yum, yum!